I think that Osamu Dazai would have been gratified by the reviews his novel The Setting Sun received when the English translation was published in the United States. Even though some of the critics were distressed by the picture the book drew of contemporary Japan, they one and all discussed it in terms received for works of importance. There was no trace of the condescension often bestowed on writings emanating from remote parts of the world, and for once nobody thought to use the damned objective exquisite about an unquestionably Japanese product. It was judged among its peers the moving and beautiful books of the present generation. One aspect of The Setting Sun puzzled many readers, however, and many puzzled others in Dazai's second novel, No Longer Human, the role of Western culture in Japanese life today. Like Yozo, the chief figure of No Longer Human, Dazai grew up in a small town in the remote north of Japan, and we might have expected his novels to be marked by the simplicity, love of nature, and purity of sentiments of the inhabitants of such a place. However, Dazai's family was rich and educated, and from his childhood days, he was familiar with European literature. American movies, reproductions of modern paintings and sculpture, and much else of our civilization. And these became such important parts of his own experience that he could not help being influenced by them, and he mentioned them quite as freely as might any other author in Europe or America. In reading his works, however, we are sometimes made aware that Dazai's understanding or use of these elements of the West is not always the same as ours. It is easy to conclude from this that Dazai had only digested half of them, or even that the Japanese as a whole have somehow misappropriated our culture. I confess that I found this parochialism curious in the United States. Here where our suburbs are jammed with a variety of architecture which bears no relation to the antecedents of either the builders or the dwellers, where white people sing Negro spirituals and a Negro soprano sings Lucia de Lammermoor in a metropolitan opera, where our celebrated national dishes, the Frankfurter, the hamburger, and chow mein, betray by their very names non-American origins. Can we with honesty rebuke the Japanese for a lack of purity in their modern culture? And can we criticize them for borrowing them from us when we were almost as conspicuously in their debt? We find it normal that we drink tea, their beverage, but curious that they should drink whiskey, ours. Our professional decorators, without thinking to impart to us an adequate background in Japanese aesthetics, decree that we should brighten our rooms with Buddhist sanctuaries or with lamps in the shapes of paper lanterns. Yet we are apt to find an incongruence if a Japanese ornament in his room with examples of Christian religious art or a lamp of Venetian glass. Why does it seem so strange that another country should have a culture as conglomerate as our own? There are, it is true, works of recent Japanese literature which are relatively untouched by Western influence, and with some of them are splendidly written, and convince us that we are getting from them what is most typically Japanese in modern fiction. If, however, we do not wish to resemble the Frenchmen who find the detective story the only worthwhile part of the American literature, we must also be willing to read Japanese novels in which a modern, and by modern I mean Western, intelligence is at work. A writer with such intelligence, Dazai was one, may also be attracted to the Japanese traditional culture, but it will virtually be with the eyes of a foreigner who finds it appealing by remote. Dostoevsky and Proust are much closer to him than any Japanese writer of, say, the 18th century. Yet we should be unfair to consider such a writer a cultural destiny. He is not much farther removed from his 18th century, after all, than we are from ours. In his case, to be sure, a foreign culture has intervened, but that culture is now in its third generation in Japan, and no Japanese thinks of his business suit as an outlandish or affected garb. It is only what he normally wears, but was probably also the costume of his father and grandfather before him. To wear Japanese garments would actually be strange and uncomfortable for most men. The majority of Japanese of today wear modern Western culture also as they wear their clothes, and to keep reminding them that their ancestors originally attired themselves otherwise is at once bad manners and foolish. It may be wondered at the same time if the Japanese knowledge of the West is more than a set of clothes, however long worn or well tailored. Only a psychologist could properly attempt to answer so complex a question, although innumerable casual visitors to Japan have readily opined that under the foreign exterior the Japanese remain entirely unlike ourselves. I find this view hard to accept. It is true that the Japanese of today differ from Americans, perhaps not more, however, than do Greeks or Portuguese, but they are certainly much more like Americans than they are like their ancestors of 100 years ago. As far as literature is concerned, the break with the Japanese past is almost complete. In Japanese universities today, the Japanese literature department is invariably one of the smallest and least supported. The bright young men generally devote themselves to study of Western institutions or literature, and the academic journals are filled with learned articles of the symbolism of the Concha de Lisle or on the correspondence of James Knox Polk. The fact that these articles will never be read abroad, not even by specialists in Leconte de Lisle or James Knox Polk, inevitably creates a sense of isolation and even loneliness among intellectuals. And some Japanese of late have taken to referring themselves as the orphans of Asia, indicating and perhaps lamenting the fact that although Japan has become isolated from the rest of Asia, the Western nations do not accept her literature or learning as part of their own. The Japanese writers of today are cut off from Asian literature as completely as the United States is from Latin American literature. By the conviction that there is nothing to learn, this attitude may be mistaken, but I remember how shocked a Japanese novelist, a friend of mine, was to see his own name included on a list of Lebanese, Iraqi, Burmese, and miscellaneous other Asian writers who had been sponsored by an American foundation. He would undoubtedly have preferred to figure at the tail end of a list of Western writers or world's writers in general than to be classed with such obscure exotics. We might like to reprimand the Japanese for the neglect of their own traditional culture, or to insist that Japanese writers should be proud to be associated with other Asians, but such advice comes too late. As a result of our repeated and forcible intrusions in the past, Western tastes are coming to dominate letters everywhere. The most we have reason to expect in the future are world variants of a single literature, of the kind which already exists naturally in Europe. No Longer Human is almost symbolic of the predicament of the Japanese writers today. It is the story of a man who is orphaned from his fellows by the refusal to take him seriously. He is denied the love of his father, taken advantage of by friends, and finally, in turn, is cruel to the women who love him. He does not insist because of his experiences that the others are all wrong and he alone right. On the contrary, he records with devastating honesty his every single transgression of a code of human conduct which he cannot fathom. Yet, as Dazai realized, if the eye of the novel did not, the cowardly acts and moments of abject collapse do not tell the whole story. In a superb epilogue, the only objective witness testifies, "He was an angel," and we are suddenly made to realize the incompleteness of Yozo's portrait of himself. In the way that most men fail to see their own cruelty, Yozo had not noticed his gentleness and his capacity for love. Yozo's experiences are certainly not typical of all Japanese intellectuals, but the sense of isolations which they feel between themselves and the rest of the world is perhaps akin to Yozo's conviction that he alone is not human. Again, his frustrations at the university, his unhappy involvement with the Communist Party, his disastrous love affairs, all belong to the past of many writers of today. At the same time, detail after detail clearly is derived from the At the same time, detail after detail clearly is derived from the individual experiences of Osamu Dazai himself. The temptation is strong to consider the book as a barely fictionalized autobiography, but this would be a mistake, I am sure. Dazai had the creative artistry of a great cameraman. His lens is often trained on the moments of his own past, but thanks to his brilliant skill in composition and selection, his photographs are not what we expect to find cluttering an album, and there is nothing of the meandering reminiscer about Dazai. With him, all is sharp, brief, and evocative. Even if each scene of No Longer Human were the exact reproduction of an incident from Dazai's life, of course this is not the case, his technique would qualify the whole work as one of original fiction. No Longer Human is not a cheerful book, yet its effect is far from that of a painful wound gratuitously inflicted on the reader. As a reviewer, Richard Gilman in Jubilee wrote of Dazai's earlier novel, "Such is the power of art to transfigure what is objectively ignoble or depraved, that the setting sun is actually deeply moving and even inspiriting. To know the nature of despair and to triumph over it in ways that are possible to oneself. Imagination was Dazai's only weapon, is surely a sort of grace." I think the largest part in this foreword, is the fact that this is talking about how the book itself is one of isolation. and specifically with the fact that English translators for Japanese works are, when creating other works, I don't know, I don't understand it too well, but I think the main idea is just that there is an irony in the isolation that the plot finds itself in with the people of the world that are of Asian descent, individuals that are translating themselves in literature. They feel, because it's a sort of lost art, as the East finds itself copying more of the West. It begins losing a bit of its identity in and of itself in that process. When Japanese literature, I guess, is translated, the purpose is for it to be preserved. So there's a bit of a dichotomy there, where something that is meant to be preserving something is actually creating a facsimile of itself, which, I don't know, I'm just saying words, but it's interesting. And it paints a picture that Dazai himself is a very artistic individual, and that behind all the pretension, all the pretentious reviews of people from the Jubilee, for example, there is a sort of grace to the literature he creates when talking about such isolation. And so that was really what caught the attention of the book for me in the first place. I learned from this book that there were feelings that could be conveyed through just words that could be so vivid. Before this, I didn't realize that a book could really evoke such a feeling. For me, this book evoked a feeling of fear, almost, of uneasiness, the kind of stuff you'd watch from a thriller, or a really good thriller. You'd feel like an out-of-body experience watching something. You'd feel I don't know, I guess that thrill, that fear of something, of the unknown, of the uncanny. Every description of Yozo himself, whenever he would be talking about in the photographs, freaked me the fuck out. And just the fact that I got freaked out over a pair of words, because it just evoked such a vivid image in my head, I was like, damn, maybe there's something of value here. Which is then what brought me to finish the book, and finish it with a perspective of, damn, books can offer a lot more than I initially thought out, which I think is why I picked out this book in particular to first begin with, because it's what started my journey in discovering literature and beginning to value it as a form of art, on par with movies, video games, music. That words have power, and with the correct amount of attention given to it, you have plenty of creativity at play when reading. It can evoke even memories in words, in letters, in feelings, and that fascinates me. Which then brings us to the prologue. I have seen 3 pictures of the man. The fist, the first a childhood photograph you might call, shows him about the age of 10, a small boy surrounded by a great many women, his sisters and cousins, no doubt. He stands in brightly checked trousers by the edge of a garden pond. His head is tilted at an angle 30 degrees to the left, and his teeth are barred in an ugly smirk. Ugly, you may well question of the word. For insensitive people, that is to say, those different to matters of beauty and ugliness, would mechanically comment with a bland, loquacious expression. What an adorable little boy. It is quite true that what commonly passes for adorable is sufficiently present in this child's face to give a modicum of meaning to the compliment. But I think that anyone who had ever been subjected to the least exposure to what makes for beauty would most likely toss the photograph to one side with the gesture employed in brushing away a caterpillar, and mutter in profound revulsion, "What a dreadful child!" Indeed, the more carefully you examine the child's smiling face, the more you feel an indescribable, unspeakable horror creeping over you. You see that it is not a smiling face at all. The boy has not a suggestion of a smile. Look at his tightly clenched fists if you want proof. No human being can smile with his fists doubled like that. It is a monkey, a grinning monkey face. The smile is nothing more than a puckering of ugly wrinkles. The photograph reproduces an expression so freakish at the same time so unclean and even nauseating that your impulse is to say, "What a wizened, hideous little boy." I had never seen a child with such an unaccountable expression. The face in the second snapshot is startlingly unlike the first. He is a student in his picture, although it is not clear whether it dates from high school or college days. At any rate, he is now extraordinarily handsome. But here again, the face fails inexplicably to give the expression of belonging to a living human being. He wears a student's uniform, and a white handkerchief peeps from his breast pocket. He sits in a wicker chair with his legs crossed. Again, he is smiling, this time not the wizened monkey grin, but a rather adroit little smile. And yet somehow it is not the smile of a human being. It utterly lacks substance. All of what we might call the heaviness of blood, or perhaps the solidity of human life, it has not even a bird's weight. It is merely a blank sheet of paper, light as feather, and it is smiling. The picture produces in short a sensation of complete artificiality. Pretense, insincerity, fatuousness, none of these words quite cover it. And of course, you couldn't dismiss it simply as dandyism. In fact, if you look carefully, you will begin to feel that there is something strangely unpleasant about this handsome young man. I have never seen a young man whose good looks were so baffling. And the remaining photograph is the most monstrous of all. It is quite impossible in this one to guess the age, though the hair seems to be streaked somewhat with gray. It was taken in a corner of an extraordinarily dirty room. You can plainly see in the picture how the wall is crumbling in 3 places. His small hands are held in front of him. This time he is not smiling, there is no expression whatsoever. The picture has a genuinely chilling, foreboding quality, as if it caught him in the act of dying as he sat before the camera, his hands held over a heater. That is not the only shocking thing about it. The head is shown quite large, and you can examine the features in detail. The forehead is average, the wrinkles on the forehead average, the eyebrows also average, the eyes, the nose, the mouth, the chin. The face is not merely devoid of expression, it fails even to leave a memory. It has no individuality. I have only to shut my eyes after looking at it to forget the face. And I can remember the wall of the room, the little heater, but all impression of the face of the principal figure in the room is blotted out. I am unable to recall a single thing about it, and this face can never be made the subject of a painting, not even of a cartoon. I open my eyes, and there is not even the pleasure of recollection. Of course, that's the kind of face it is. To state the matter in the most extreme terms, when I open my eyes and look at the photograph a second time, I still cannot remember it. Besides, it rubs against me the wrong way, and makes me feel so uncomfortable that in the end I want to avert my eyes. I think that even a death mask would hold more of an expression, leave more of a memory. That effigy suggests nothing so much as a human body, to which a horse's head has been attached. Something ineffable makes the beholder shudder in distaste. I have never seen such an inscrutable face of a man. Funny enough, the actual word at the end is I have never seen such an inscrutable face on a man. As I read it too quickly, it's beginning to be problematic because I'm not making any sense of the words. But this chapter was it. This was it. What I was talking about earlier in the early portion was how, this book is what changed my perspective on what a book can be. It brought along very vivid imagery, and my imagination took place in me feeling this sense of unease when reading the book, and it's what inspired me to read more beyond it, because this description of this kid's face, man, it's just freaky as fuck, and it's just, I don't know. I could think it's just in the passion that the actual narrator writes, the disgust, and portrays the unease that they experience when looking at the photograph, that it's as if you're hearing somebody else's, account of it. As if you were talking to a friend in a bar and they're talking about this person that he saw in a photograph. Like, it's very vivid. And it's as if I'm listening to a person speak to me, which I think is what makes certain literature easier to read than others, when rather you're reading something that feels like a script, or it's very cumbersome, like a textbook, a definition. That's what makes a book hard to read. But if it's more like a conversation that you're having with the book, where there's space to breathe, space to laugh, space to just take in the adjectives to paint the picture, right? When it gives you space to do all that, then you can actually feel a lot more of what's on the page, rather than trying to jam as much detail in one page without being able to take a breath, where to the point where you kind of lose the point of what you're talking about. I think an example of that would be Yukio Mishima, where whilst he writes very beautifully, Yukio writes very beautifully. Sometimes he goes too deep into details into certain things, and I kind of forget what the fuck we're talking about. And the same can kind of be said for the Game of Thrones books, where I kind of get confused in all the humbo jumbo of the different bloodlines, and I have a really hard time remembering like lessons from history in the books and the plot. So I'm supposed to remember this like king from like eons before the main plot is actually occurring right now, and I just forget. I cannot keep up with like multiple character like histories and bloodlines. It's what's problematic for me, because it feels like a textbook. It feels like a textbook rather than somebody talking to me, which becomes increasingly more complicated the more you try to read like a big length novel. Like, you know, I guess that's what dialogue is for, right? But like productive dialogue, not dialogue that is like spoon-fed to you, where exposition does not feel like a textbook. It feels like an organic production of information that flows and ebbs in a digestible format, rather than just being fed to you by a fucking teleprompter. Which kind of sounds like what I'm doing right now. As I read this, I'm tumbling on my words, and it sounds like I'm reading off of a teleprompter, and sometimes when I reflect on what I just read, I forget what I just read because I'm focusing on saying the words rather than digesting it. I think as I read this book, it's going to be a lesson on doing that, to be productive in reading what I'm saying, but also understanding it, and for it to sound good. Who knows? The next page is 21.